Hi there and welcome to this episode 4 in series 2 of the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast, a podcast show all about raising awareness, influencing behaviour and fostering an appropriate organisational culture. My name is Bruce Hallas and I'm the host of the show, and it's an absolute privilege to have you here. I really do enjoy taking the show and sharing it with people, and we've had some amazing feedback over the last couple of weeks as a result of being invited by the SANS Institute to actually take part in their 4th European Education and Awareness Summit, which was held in London. And at the summit, SANS asked me to sign a number of my books, the Rethinking the Human Factor book. And as part of that, I got to meet a whole range of education and awareness folks, whether they be education and awareness managers, or they were independent consultants who were providing consulting and support to organizations with the challenges of awareness, behavior and culture. And it was fabulous. The feedback we had on the show was absolutely awesome. We get good feedback, and it's always great to hear and share that with the team. But to be sort of in a room where so many people had already heard of the show and the things they had to say, it was pretty mind-blowing, actually. And I was very touched that we're sort of part of the movement, I think, within the industry about, challenging how we're doing things and looking for what is the next step in terms of maturing our approach to the challenges that we face around the human factor. So, one, really want to say thanks to the SANS Institute and to Lance for inviting us along. 2, I want to say thank you to everybody that listened to the show. 3, everybody that bought a book at the show. I made an offer to you to be able to send you 9 separate videos, 1 for each chapter. And I said I would send them via email, but we actually figured out, when we looked at it, that whilst we got permission from you to actually send the receipts for the books, we didn't actually get a record of your permission to actually receive the videos, which is obviously a GDPR issue. So if you bought a book at the SANS event, you want the 9 videos, 1 sent every week, to be sent to you, which is a 1-minute summary from me about the main message from each individual chapter, pop me an email at podcast@rethinking, so that's re-thinking-thehumanfactor.com. Alternatively, drop me an email at bruce.hallas@marmaladebox.com. Anyway, who have we got for you this time round? Well, once again, we've been able to find an absolutely fantastic guest, and our guest today specializes in organizational change with a slight twist in the sense that what she's doing, similar to what Stella Collins was doing, was applying the broadening understanding of how the brain works on the physical and an unconscious level to designing organizational change to bring it around more effectively. And the lady who's going to be on our show today is a lady by the name of Hilary Scarlett. How did I first find out about Hilary? Well, when I started my research into the human factor about 6.5 years ago, the early research led me to then identifying a whole new range of disciplines I wanted to have a look at. And one of those was organizational change. I mean, after all, it sort of does make sense. Really, what we're trying to do when it comes to the human factor is either to change levels of awareness, change behavior and change culture, or to maintain existing good levels of awareness, behavior or culture. So the whole point of change really became an anchor for me upon which I did a lot of research. And as part of that, organizational change was one of those research directions that I followed. And I came across Hilary's book as part of a number of different research materials that I was able to identify. And I read the book, and it was a brilliant book. And I found it really easy to read. And in the show notes, we'll make sure you know what the name of the book is. But yeah, I came across Hilary. I reached out to her. She got back in contact with me, and she was super excited about how I was trying to apply the things that she was talking about and the science behind the angles that she was pursuing in terms of organizational change. She was really super excited about how I was taking that and pointing it in a quite different direction, which was that around cybersecurity. But she really got it, and she really wanted to come on the show and have a chat. So without further ado, let's get on with the interview. Hi there and welcome to the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallas. And today on the show, we have Hilary Scarlett. Now, I first came across Hilary as part of the research that we did back in the day. So that's what we started at 6-7 years ago now. And I came across Hilary as an author of a book, which is called Neuroscience for Organizational Change. And I read the book, and one of the things I really loved about the book was how Hilary had taken something, when I hear the phrase neuroscience, I was never really that, I was going to say keen. I think I wasn't very good at science, and when I was younger, and so the whole idea of anything that's sort of neuroscience, it would probably drive fear into my heart initially, and I put off reading about neuroscience. But eventually, I got to the point where I had to get to grips with it, and Hilary's book was one of those books that helped me get to grips with it. But more importantly, I think what Hilary did is she really, really applies sort of neuroscience to everyday stuff that we can all get our heads around, and that helped me a lot. So Hilary was part of the neuroscience research stream that I put together, and so I reached out to Hilary, and guess what? She replied to the email, and she's on the show. So Hilary, I'd like to welcome you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure. Honestly, everything I said about the book was absolutely spot on. I just love the way you just. I mean, when you get a book that you don't really want to put down, this is one of those books. I really found it easy to read, so I'd recommend it to everybody, and we will put it in the show notes as well.
Great.
So, thanks for coming on the show. We like to start every show off by asking our guests to sort of explain a little bit about themselves and what their journey has been to date to get them to where they are. So do you want to let us know a little bit about yourself?
Sure. A bit about my background. So I have worked in organisational change for many years, both in the public and private sector. And my area of interest has always been, how do you get people to change? So for many years, I kind of trailed behind the strategy consultants of this world, and was always a bit frustrated as to why were the strategy consultants and others in very early in terms of a change, a merger, acquisition, restructuring, whatever it might be. And why were those of us who were interested in the people side very late in the day, at the very last minute, about, right, we've got this change program now, how to get people behind it. And I don't know why that is. I don't know why the people side often left to the last moment. But maybe it's partly because we're seen as being people a bit unpredictable, I guess, in terms of how we respond to change. Some people are fine with it, some people are not so fine with it. I guess we probably always have days when we're okay with change, no days when we're not so okay. So, and about 10 years ago, I came across an article written by a psychiatrist saying we can now understand enough about the human brain to apply it to the real world and to the world of work. And I thought that's really interesting. Maybe if we could bring a bit more science to what goes on in organisations when they're going through change, that would be helpful. So originally I went off and studied applied neuroscience with neuroscience in the States. Over the last 4 years or so, have been working with neuroscientists both in the States and at University College London here in the UK. And I kind of see my role as taking their work out of the lab and as you say, trying to make it really practical and useful to leaders and managers, because I'm a big believer that if we could all just understand our brains a little bit better, what a difference that would make to us.
Yeah. I mean, we really, what you're talking about, even if it's just a small improvement in terms of our knowledge of our brains, it ties into that whole marginal gain, doesn't it?
No, absolutely. I think, for most of us, all we've got is our brains to work with. In many organisations, that's all we've got. So, you can either work in ignorance of your brain or despite it, or you can understand it a little bit better and work with it. And I think when I was doing my studies and the work I do, I think on a personal level, it's incredibly useful, just understanding a bit more. If suddenly I'm a bit distracted or something happens in a meeting, understanding what's going on. I think in terms of understanding others, I think in terms of understanding organisations as a whole, it's just incredibly useful. As you say, it's these marginal gains, it's little things can make a big difference to our brains, be it positively or be it negatively. And just being aware of that in ourselves, if something suddenly set me off, or in other people, I think is incredibly useful. That's
really interesting insight straight away. And it reminds me a little bit of a quote from Edgar Schein, from A Change. And he talks about understanding, I'm trying to remember the exact quote, but he's talking about, if we don't understand these forces, then our lives are shaped by them. And it's that sense of, if you choose not to actually understand how the brain works, okay, then you're less in control, less able to manage the outcome of whatever that process is. Yeah. And I think what you're just highlighting there, better understanding ourselves. So, yeah, having that moment to be able to see, when you respond to something, being able to go, why am I doing that?
Yes. Why is something? Yes. So it says something to me. Why am I suddenly responding in that way? Is really useful.
Yeah, and then understanding that in others, and I guess from a sort of very traditional security perspective, it's not necessarily the right thing to use, the right terminology, though it probably is something familiar with most people in security. When we do what we call risk assessments, we sort of like go, okay, what's the vulnerability in a system, a process, or that sort of stuff. Now, vulnerability has this very negative connotation, and that's a very cultural type of thing. But then you have the threats that exploit the vulnerabilities. You can have a vulnerability, but it's, that's not a major problem until there's a threat around that exploits it. And in effect, what you're sort of talking about there is, I'll use the word vulnerability, but just bear with me that I don't see it in a negative context. It's like a vulnerability in terms of how our brains process. This is how our brain process. It can be a vulnerability as much as it can be a benefit.
Yes.
And when you understand that, you then start to understand how potentially you can either leverage that to bring around change, okay, or you can become subject to it.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that's one of the things that I really, from all my work, and that includes looking at your work, I would just look at that and go, yeah, if we don't understand these things, we're missing an opportunity to bring around, in your case, organisational change in a more efficient, effective way.
Yeah, and I think you say we can be buffeted around by these things if we don't understand them. And I really do think, although the brain's a hugely complicated thing, I do think we probably have more control over how we respond to things than we realise. And again, I think if we can just understand a little bit about what's going on in our brains, then perhaps we have more choice about how we respond in certain situations. Yeah. And I think that bit about choice and choosing how we respond to people in a meeting or something that suddenly happened, I think makes a big difference to how we perform at work in our working day and how enjoyable our working day is.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting there, because in my experience of doing that, is that often when I get talking to to people within organisations and where they're on cybersecurity awareness type thing, we end up speaking to other people in other areas of the business. And there was one client springs straight to mind, and their strategy program manager was like, we could be using this stuff across here, and here as well. And that's the stuff that you do. You've been doing that change across organisations now for quite some time and applying this to that. And it's like, it's a natural thing to shift it over into the cybersecurity domain as well. It's just change again, isn't it? It's changing levels of awareness, changing in behaviour, and changing in maybe organisational culture as well.
Yes, and I think we all know it, that there's just so much change in organisations in any aspect of an organisation, and it is kind of speeding up. And in a way, there is no change programme anymore because we never get to the end of that change programme because more change kicks in. Yeah, and we've got change kind of on a macro scale, but also on a micro scale. I guess we try and plan for the big changes, but there's lots of little changes going on in the organisation constantly. And it's how do we deal with that, and how do we help people get through? And I think one of the interesting things to know about the brains, on the whole, our brains don't like organisational change. They're not designed to like it. And I think it's an important message to all of us that if we're struggling with change or finding it hard, that new system, that new way of doing things, and this new sort of values that have come in, whatever it is, if we're finding it hard to change, there is a bit of that we can kind of say to ourselves, it's because our brains don't like it. On the whole, what our brains want to do is they like to be lazy. So it's one of the reasons why our brains like habits. Yeah. So there's a bit of it in all of us. If we're running a team meeting the same old way, and our brains probably tend to say, just keep doing it that way because it's the way you've done it. It's easy. It's less effort. You don't have to think about it so much. So I think we've always got to kind of pinch ourselves and say, am I running this meeting or whatever I'm doing, am I doing it this way because it's the best way to do it? Or am I doing it because my brain is kind of saying, just keep doing it the same old way. It's the way you know, it's less effort. So we have got to be aware of that for all sorts of reasons, our brains don't like change. And one of them being because our brains they do like habits. They don't like expending more effort and more energy. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons why.
Absolutely. So we're starting to wander off into areas which I really want to be covering a little bit later, but I want to bring us back. Right, when I did my initial piece of work, I was like, okay, where does all the decision making happen? The brain. And so what would be great is we could bring it back to the basics, the brain.
Yeah.
Can you just quickly flick through? Okay, for people that go, okay, people just think it's a brain. Can you enlighten people without going too far into it? Okay, the brain is not—it's not just a brain, but what it does, how is it made, sort of basic sort of structure, that type of thing.
Yeah, well, obviously it's a hugely complicated thing, and I guess one of the key bits of the brain, I guess we all need to know about is, well, I guess one point is that most of our thinking is done subconsciously. Most of what's going on in our brain we're just not aware of. I guess that kind of metaphor of the iceberg is useful here again, that we're aware of the conscious thinking the brain is doing, but most of what our brain is doing is going on without us being even aware of it. So we're only aware of a tiny bit of all the stuff that our brain is doing. One bit of the brain I think is really important for people to know about is the prefrontal cortex. And that's the bit of our brain that's behind our foreheads and is often referred to as the executive center of the brain, because it's the part of the brain where we do our decision making, our analytical thinking, our emotional control cortex. So it's a really important part of the brain. And that is the part of the brain that has actually evolved with our ancestors. The rest of our brains pretty much have not changed since we were out on the and so a lot of our brains are doing about threat and response. And one thing we need to be aware of is often when we are in a state of change in organisation, that we still go back into flight or fight mode. So those parts of the brain that get us ready to run away or to fight, the limbic system, which is the emotional system that contains part of the brain called the amygdala, that's very responsive to external threats. That part of the brain can take over in a sense when we're faced by what our brain perceives to be a threat in the organisation. So prefrontal cortex is a bit to be very aware of. People hear people talk about the limbic system, the sort of the emotional bit of how our brain processes emotions. Obviously, there's other parts of our brain. A huge amount of our brain is given over to processing vision, and actually the visual cortex is quite a big part of the brain, and obviously there's other parts of the brain that just keep us breathing and all homeostasis, all that good stuff that just keeps us alive that we're not even aware of. So motor cortex, the brain able us to move. I mean, so all sort of kind of sensory things are obviously processed through the brain as well. But I think if people need to know about one bit, it's probably the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system.
Yeah, and I think that's I completely agree with that from the research. So the other areas which are of interest, but I think the core areas, if people want to start, picking something up quite quickly, PFC, the prefrontal cortex, basically that's where your cognitive thinking goes. Or that's where you're challenging people, you're giving people new content, you're asking them to think through a given problem or a scenario and to come up with a solution. And the limbic, which is dealing with threats and most really important. In fact, I had somebody actually drop me a message about chapter 3 in my book around culture, and it was talking about toxic cultures and how you can have a culture within an organisation which is toxic. It could be overly, it could be overly aggressive. It could be too time driven. It could be bullying. It could be whatever it is. But toxicity that makes people anxious.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
And makes people stressed.
Yes.
And actually what he picked up, which always was great that he picked up, was that actually we make decisions in environments. And in this case, that environment is going to be playing on the limbic system. It's going to, people are going to feel under threat within their own working environment. They find it really unpleasant, emotional. And then suddenly their decisions start being influenced by that area of the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key things to understand about the brain is for the brain, the key driver for the brain is survival. That's the key thing our brains want. They just want us to survive. They want us to get through the working day. Yeah. To achieve that, two key things the brain does. It wants to rewards, so nice things that happen, but also it wants to avoid threats. But of those two, by far the more important to the brain is avoiding threats. Because we can do without rewards, we can do without shelter, we can do without food, we can even do without water for quite a while. But if the saber-toothed tiger gets you, game over, you are dead. So our brains are much more interested in threats than they are in rewards. And I think, again, it explains quite a lot. I'm sure we all had that feeling of going through perhaps an appraisal. And why is it that someone can say to us 5 things we're really good at, but just this one thing over here, if only you were better at that? why is it when we walk out that door, it's that one negative that stays in our minds? It's because the threat response is much stronger in our brains. It's more important to the brain. Almost the nice things that get said to us at work, our brain kind of dismisses, and that's nice, but it's not important in terms of survival. It's the negatives are more threatening. So you're right, we're much more attuned to threats, we're much more aware of them. And I think we're all aware, if suddenly somebody says, get an email that's quite aggressive, that's criticizing your work, we're all aware of the immediate response we have to that. And as you say, it's when we get into that state, actually, because our brains still think they're out on the savannah, blood starts to go to those parts of the brain that gets to run away or to fight the flight or fight system, and goes away from the prefrontal cortex, where we do all our considered thinking and planning. So we're distracted, we're anxious, we can't think at our best, and we need to be aware of that in ourselves when that's happening, but also if we're perhaps causing that in other people as well. And the problem, as you mentioned about toxic environments, and the problem is that it gets several problems. One, that when the amygdala is triggered, when we have the stress hormones in our brains and bodies, we're still designed to be on the savannah. We're designed to have a spurt of cortisol and adrenaline to run away from that lion or fight that other tribe. But then those stress hormones are meant to drop down in our brains. The problem with 21st century work is they never drop down. We're all constantly at a high level of cortisol and adrenaline. I mean, probably for many of us, before we even get to work, it's that difficult journey to work, it's that fight with public transport, it's the difficult child at home before you walked out of the house or whatever. Probably for many of us, before we even walk in the workplace door, we're probably already in a bit of a threat state and adrenaline cortisol are rising.
Yeah.
So, and you're right. And then and also once we're in that state, it's almost as if we begin to look at the world of work, or generally through a filter of threat. So when I'm already slightly in that state, be it a toxic environment or a difficult boss or too many demands upon me, it means that every other little thing that happens, I will start to see negatively. So I'll start to see threats that do exist as being bigger than they really are. I'll start to see threats where they don't even exist. And I'll give you an example. I was doing some work recently and people, and in the coffee break, somebody came up to me and a penny had dropped for him. And he said he's got a team member, and normally she's really high performer, normally she's great. He said, but over the last few months, he said, everything I say to her, she slightly takes it the wrong way. She's like, it's all well meant from me, but she slightly misconstrues what I'm saying. She's prickly, she's difficult. A penny had dropped for him that she's going through a difficult divorce at home. So what's that divorce at home is doing is she's coming to the workplace, and even well-intentioned advice or thought suggestions, she's slightly taking the wrong way. And we need to be aware that we all do this. If we're in this threat state, we'll start to interpret things slightly differently, slightly more negatively. So I think from the world of neuroscience, there is that point about being a bit kinder to ourselves. If we're having a tough day, it's like we're being aware of that we might be overreacting, but also being kinder to others too. That if somebody's reacting negatively, well, maybe they're under a lot of stress, maybe they've had a tough day. So it's that bit about just, I hope what the neuroscience does in a way is makes us all a bit more empathetic towards ourselves and others, and a bit more understanding about why we might be behaving in a slightly difficult way. Yeah.
Going back to what we sort of started to focus on there about the brain and the structure and its purpose. One of the things that I got from reading your book and from my broader research is that the brain as an organ within the body is a relatively small weight compared to the rest of the body, yes, but it uses up a lot of energy.
Absolutely, yeah. It's 2% of our body weight, but it uses up 20% of our energy. So extraordinary. I mean, so it uses up a huge amount. And a lot of that is just being used up into just, say, keeping us going, sort of just into the brain and keeping us going. The interesting thing is that we will use up 20% of our energy, be we working really hard at something, or be we slumped in front of trash TV. It doesn't make much difference. It will use up 20% either way. But it does go back to this point about it's part of the reason why our brains kind of want to be lazy, because it's almost as if they know they're using up this disproportionate amount of energy, so they want to be lazy. They want to do things that are less effortful.
Right.
But brains use up a huge amount of our energy.
So when it comes to bringing around organisational change, okay, how does that relate to how you bring around change? Because the thing that springs to my mind you've spoken about the prefrontal cortex, which is the cognitive thinking. That's where, we're really emptying through. But we're sort of also reflecting on the fact that there's this other side to the brain, which is more in line with the, call it lazy, or maybe another way of putting it is trying to find, the most efficient way of achieving something. It's that lazy side of the brain, the automated processing side. So you've got those two sides. One is about saving energy. The other one is going to use a lot more energy. So when you think about the work that you do, how does that have an impact upon organisation, bringing around organisational change? Just that little bit of knowledge.
Yeah, well, I think, I guess what I would say, one of the reasons perhaps explains why on the whole people don't want to change, I think, is being aware of that.
Okay.
But I guess working with the brain, one of the things that's hugely important to the brain is choice. And I think one of the problems I guess I see with many organisations when they're going through change is they do kind of disappear into the darkened room with the strategy consultant, whoever it might be, and then kind of emerge saying, here's the change, here's why it's a good idea, here's why it's going to be good for customers, here's why it's good for you, blah, blah, blah. Now just get on and do it. All the research shows in terms of brain, if we feel we've chosen a course of direction, we're much more likely to be committed to it.
Yeah.
That there is this thing that if I'm being told to do it, there's a bit of my brain goes, no, I don't want to do it. And so I think one thing in terms of change is giving people a bit of chance to reach their own insights about why this is the right course of direction. That there's lots of research that shows if we choose something, we are much more committed to it. Yeah. So I certainly with clients urge them to look at the information, reflect, draw their own conclusion about why this is the right course of action. I think we need to give employees across the organisation a bit more time to just look at some of that information for themselves. So they can go, I get it. I can see why that's the right thing to do. Say if we feel we've chosen something, we actually process that thought in a different part of the brain from if I'm told to do something. Yeah. And I think it's part of the reason why there's this big shift towards coaching in organisations, because there's recognition that if you really want someone to be committed to that change or do something, if I've been in a coaching session, I've kind of recognised myself that I need to do this thing differently, then I'm much more committed to it. If my boss tells me to do it, it's a bit of me, I'll do it, but for how long? And it's just compliance. So there's that bit about choice and giving people a chance to reach their own insights. Yeah. That is one I think helps get people to want to change. I think there is this other interesting thing, actually, because there is this thing about our brains do find change hard, but there is this, but our brains can change. There's this thing called neuroplasticity that shows our brains can change and learn, and indeed well into old age. And actually, there's research coming out now that's showing actually they think learning is one thing that's quite protective in terms of our brains. If you want to have a really sharp brain in old age, one of the things that might be good for us is learning new things. So one of the things I think we can drop into the conversation away with people is actually, if you're just doing things in the same old way, that's probably not good for your brain. And actually learning difficult things, challenging your brain is good for it and could be protective in the longer term. So I think it's perhaps another message for us all there about challenge your brain, get out there and learn something difficult. Yeah. If you find it challenging, well, maybe that's good. That could be another message too. Neuroplasticity.
Yeah, I mean, I think just, listening to you there, the first, sort of take a step backwards, you were talking about getting people actually involved, making it feel like it's, so instead of somebody just saying, this is the way it is, actually getting somebody involved in finding what that change is going to be. And I know from a behavioural science background, this is well established, and I think it's probably the research that you were referring to, and it's the endowment effect. The sense that people, if they've contributed to something, they feel like that they've endowed a value in it, which means that they're more likely to make a decision to comply with it because there's this value thing that's being shared, and a lot of behavioural judgments are based upon that. And I think the interview with Dan Arley points that out in series 1 of the show. And then the third one, you talk about neuroplasticity. The sense that people, it's around the rewards piece, that people actually, extrinsic and intrinsic motivations for doing something, taking part. And the whole sense of mastery. Yes, it's important. So people actually do like to feel, on the whole, there will be extremes, obviously, that they're getting to grips with something, that they're becoming masters of something, that it's something that's new. And using that as a way of framing the experience of change, whether it be in awareness or behavior or culture, whatever it is a potential tool to be used. It's just, it's part of our makeup, and you can choose to use it or you just like not to.
Yes, no, absolutely. This about learning, and there's really interesting work by Carol Dweck, who psychologist at Stanford University, and she's done a lot of work into growth and fixed mindset. And anybody who's got a child at school in the UK will know about this, because every child in the UK is being taught this. But this simple idea, there's two beliefs that either I feel like I'm born with a certain amount of ability and that's it, I can't really get better at things, that's a fixed mindset. Or this growth mindset that I am born with a certain amount of ability, but I can get better at things through effort. It means I will make mistakes along the way, but that's okay as long as I'm learning. And the beauty of this work is just knowing about a growth and fixed mindset begins to shift people's abilities. Because just knowing about a growth mindset, that belief that I can get better at things, very closely aligned in a way to neuroplasticity, that awareness that our brains can learn and change and grow and get better at things. And growth mindset, I think, is a really important thing, that if we believe we can learn, we can get better, it kind of becomes self-fulfilling, and makes a big difference in organizations. So kind of a culture where people are prepared to learn, they'll acknowledge they've made mistakes, but they say, okay, so I'm learning from it, I'm progressing. So I think that's a really important thing to have in the culture in the organization, to this growth mindset, learning from mistakes, an organisation that's being prepared to learn is also really important.
Yeah. Go back to the point of the brain and body and mental fatigue. So a message was sent through to me asking, is there any truth in their understanding that when you're trying to bring around change, that there is probably, if people are mentally exhausted, you've got to the end of the day, and people are mentally exhausted, but you're actually asking them to use the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, and do cognitive thinking, there is a time to actually talk to people about things, or to try and ingrain habits. So, or to use habits. Habits are less energy intensive. Cognitive thinking is more energy intensive. Does it make sense that there is a time in the day when people are going to be at the most sort of, I guess, alert, mentally energized and physically energized? Is there any truth in that the brain is going to work more effectively for different tasks at different points in the day?
I mean, certainly, I think one of the key things that our brains are brilliant things, but they cannot be brilliant all day long. I mean, we've got kind of limited mental capacity. And we all know, as you say, by the time we get to the end of the day, often our brains are kind of frazzled. We're tired, we're exhausted. So I think there is something about recognizing you can't keep just pushing your brain more and more. So I certainly think there is something about recognizing when your good points are in the day, and for many people that will be in the morning, but not necessarily. I think being aware of what kind of tasks do deplete your energy, but what kind of tasks restore your energy too. I think it's also about being aware of that. Again, I think once we're aware of those things, we can kind of manage ourselves better. So I think if you've got really important work to do, really important thinking work to do, I would say get on with that and do that first thing, because it's very easy to use up lots of your mental energy on unimportant stuff. So, if you've got a really important meeting this afternoon where you've got to be absolutely your sharpest and your best thinking, I would think carefully about what you're doing in the morning, because if you're already doing lots of stuff in the morning that's quite mentally taxing, are you really going to be your best form in the afternoon? So I do think that one of the things I say to people, before you do anything in your working day, look at what you've got coming up in the day. What's the most important work you've got to get done, and prioritise that. And do that before you even look at your emails, because once you start looking at your emails, that's somebody else what they want you to do. So I really say to people, don't look at emails, think about the work, write down what you've got to get done and what your priority is. Then you can look at your emails. Because
absolutely brilliant.
Otherwise, we all just get caught up in answering. And it feels good. We've got a few good hours. There's a few good hours could go on answering your emails. And then you've got a really important meeting in the afternoon. Actually, your brain's gone a bit already because you spent all the time answering emails. So there's definitely something about thinking about the working day.
That's so good to hear that, because it's something I'm an absolute believer in, that because of my own experience, that sense of, people, the first thing they do when they get in work, and actually quite often before they even get to work, let's be, brutally honest about it, that they're reading email.
Absolutely. Yeah, a number of people I work with, a number of clients I work with, they say, on the train coming in or whatever, they're already checking their emails, or before they leave home, they're already checking their emails. So they're already into what other people want from them. And there is that thing about stop, pause, grab back a bit of control. What do you want to get out of the working day?
Yeah. And I think it's that, for me, that's an interesting idea. It's like when you understand why that happens, then you can start going, okay, where else is this playing out? Where else can, that bit of insight help me make the most? When you've got an audience, it's interesting. I get asked to do quite a lot of talks.
Yes.
And even when I do my own training, you have to recognize that as part of, if it's a really, I'm going to challenge people, I really want to be doing the presentation early in the day. It's not that I want to be off in the afternoon. It's just that it's a lot more effective in the day, earlier in the day. Whereas if you're if you're at the end of the day, you've got to think about what your presentation technique, and which is interesting because most conference organizers don't see the amount of effort that a lot of speakers, I think, go into thinking about what am I actually going to say to the audience? What are we going to do? Where are they at as an audience? So that I can, basically produce content and use a delivery technique or style which is suited to really where they're at in the day and how much energy they've got.
Yeah, absolutely. And with clients, when I'm running workshops, I always say, can we do it in the morning? Because you just see a difference if you're running the same workshop in the afternoon. Yeah. And in fact, one of my clients recently said to me, they'd actually been looking at, they'd been running some workshops, the exact same workshop, bit morning or afternoon. They were looking at the feedback and they could see the feedback was that bit more positive. In the morning, and said it was same trainer, same content over quite a few workshops, and I think that's right. That it's so I think doing the important stuff in the morning and just being aware of the afternoon. I mean, that said, there are things that we can do. Get out and go for a walk. I mean, exercise is really important. Get out of the office. Go into, especially today, go into the sunshine. There are things that we can do to restore some of that mental energy. Having a good old laugh, it's good. Actually, laughter is a great de-stressor. There's some great research that's come out of Warwick about where they did various different interventions, and they got everybody to do an IQ test first, and then one group got to watch a DVD of Bill Bailey, the comedian. Yeah. And then they did another IQ test after that, and their IQ went up by 10 to 12%. So they got more responses right just by having a good old laugh at a Bill Bailey DVD. So there are things that we can do during the course of the day to get our brains back on track as well. So we can help, I think. But so things like exercise, laughter, making sure we're eating, really important to make sure we're eating properly.
Lots of water.
Water, very good for the brain, absolutely. So there are things that we can do to help ourselves. Taking a nap. I mean, I know most organisations, that's not an acceptable thing to do yet, but, Google doesn't have sleep pods for no reason. Things like actually having a 20-minute nap or practicing a bit of mindfulness or whatever it might be, again, has been shown to really kind of restore our mental energy during the day.
Yeah, and I think that's a theme that we're starting to see more of in society, the sort of appreciation of the fact that the world that we live in creates a whole range of pressure upon upon us as individuals. They're like really coming down to a pressure on the brain, and that the whole mental health agenda has broadened and deepened at last, and is up there. And it's been great actually to see on LinkedIn. We've had mental health awareness sort of days and weeks now. It's become that sort of recognised as that important and an issue going forward, because, like you say, creativity, innovation, the progress that we need as a society, it comes from the brain. And
absolutely, that's all we've got. Really, that's all we've got. It is our brains, and as you said, I absolutely agree. I think at last we became much more aware of looking after the brain. I think, we've had things about looking after the body and exercise and what we should eat and whatever to keep the body well, but also there's more recognition, I think, now about what does a healthy brain need.
Yeah.
And some of the things we've touched on. Sleep, hugely important, getting a good night's sleep. And and when we're sleeping, lots of interesting things go on in our brains in terms of processing thoughts and improving skills. And so I say to people again, if you're dealing with a knotty problem, talk about it one day at work, sleep on it, come back together again the next day, and you'll have a much more fruitful, interesting discussion the next day, because sleep does all sorts of fantastic things in terms of helping us to process thoughts and ideas and develop ideas. So sleep, very important.
Yeah. So, think through what you're just saying. It's just a sense of, because one of the challenges that we have within the security industry is that often the opportunity to raise awareness and influence behavior through, for example, training in some way or facilitating discussions or workshops, you tend to get relatively small slots, and you might get you won't get them that often. And that whole thing about, if you're lucky, you might get a day or half a day to be able to do some sort of workshop, etc. But actually, sometimes by the mere fact that people turn around and say, look, it's really important to us, but we're going to give you half a day to come and sit down with our senior leadership team or whatever, that actually then you need to almost go back and say, well, no, I appreciate that. But, actually there's evidence out there which is highlighting the fact that actually trying to do something over a half day or a day, we're going to hit these barriers, and that you're only going to walk out with, a much smaller amount of value from this, which, you've got to ask the question, does that justify you just taking, the day out? Taking a whole day out. Maybe you split it into 2 half days and you run it over, and you make sure there's, one's at the beginning of the week and one's like midweek or the end of the week or something like that.
Well, certainly I like that idea of splitting it out over time. Again, there's a lot about, in terms of learning, because the danger is also, I think, this pressure to reduce learning to shorter and shorter amounts of time. The danger is you just delivering information at people, and people aren't really learning. There's been information thrown at them. And again, from the world of neuroscience, there's a lot about learning over time. Really, really helps to embed it. So that's that idea of perhaps doing 2 half days, so people can go away, absorb, give something a go, and come back again, I think is really, really important. So short amounts, okay, as long as you're not trying to put too much information into those short slots. But say spacing it then over time is really important in terms of learning.
So going back to why our brains don't actually like change. Okay, because I get there's an assumption that people say, it's like you were describing right at the beginning of our chat. You're talking about how the strategy consultants come in and they have this grand vision. They work with senior leadership team and they go, okay, this is where we want to be. This is how we're going to get there. And then the change people get brought in. So like, okay, now deliver this.
Yes. Yeah.
It's like, in rugby terminology, it would be called the hospital pass.
Right.
Which is like, right, you're going to get crushed by the scrum or something like that. Why is it that we make this assumption that it's just going to happen? Is it that we're failing to even take the time out to understand the process of change and the role of the brain in doing that? And why does the brain really not want to change at all? Obviously it's lazy, so it prefers to do what it wants to do, but
That's habits, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess sometimes because once leaders have gone through that opportunity to learn and make decisions about what direction the company needs to go in, maybe they kind of lose sight of the fact that they've had that opportunity to say wrap their heads around the data and make a decision. And maybe it's partly culturally, that's more how we used to work, more top down, more hierarchical, telling people what to do.
Yeah.
I guess what we're learning from the world of neuroscience and behavioral science is that on the whole, people, in some occasions you've got to tell people what to do. If the building is burning, then you say, get out of the building. It's about thinking through what's appropriate at the right time. So sometimes you've got to tell people what to do in certain emergencies or whatever. But I think, leaders need to think through in certain do I need to give people a bit more time just to say, understand what's going on? I think we touched on this bit about self-esteem is really important. So if I feel that people are interested in my opinion or consult me on something, then that's important too. I mean, not that we should falsely consult people. I think it's wrong also to pretend we're consulting employees when actually we've made a decision. I think we need to be honest about that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think we can give people a bit of chance to come to terms or understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that leaders often can end up being slightly out of touch. And I think, one of the things that's really important when change is particularly difficult for us if we feel it's unpredictable and uncontrollable. And I think leaders lose sight of that. Higher up in the organisation, they've probably got a bit more sight over what's coming up. They probably feel they've got a bit more influence over what's coming up. And I often say to leaders in an organisation, you've got to bear in mind you're in a privileged position. People further down the hierarchy who feel they don't have that same sight over what's coming up and don't have that same control or influence, their brains are in a much more stressed place than your brain. And leaders need to stay aware of that. I think that a need for control, a need to be able to predict what's coming up is really important to the brain, because it kind of goes back to the savannah. That if we're on the savannah, if you can't control your environment, you're vulnerable in terms of survival. So it's why, again, our brains crave a sense of control, of influence. Our brains are, neuroscience often refers to them as being prediction machines, because our brains are constantly trying to predict, they're constantly trying to make meaning. Because again, going back to the savannah, if they can kind of predict what that change on the horizon might mean, a hostile tribe coming towards us, if they can predict those kind of things, then they're better placed to protect us. So our brains in the workplace everywhere are constantly trying to predict, constantly trying to make meaning, and change gets in the way of that. Change means I can't predict what's coming up. I know and our brains don't like it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, picking up there, the whole sight thing, which is, for the listener, we often use the phrase in the security industry about security awareness. One of the things I challenge people on is, what do you mean by awareness? And the emphasis of awareness tends to be about making other people aware. And actually, I just think there's room for us to rethink that and something like, how aware are we as individuals? And it's the whole awareness, the definition of it, the scope of it. The whole point you're saying there is that how people further down the chain within the organizational structure, if they haven't got sight, i.e. they're not aware of what's this direction we're heading, why we're heading it that way, they're not aware of the people that represent them in the organization and their involvement in terms of helping define that direction and what's required, then it does make people anxious.
Absolutely.
I think all the cultural studies, if you look at, what culture actually is, culture at the heart of it really reduces anxiety amongst groups of individuals by providing a structure. So like, these are the overriding values, these are the rituals within the culture, etc. And I think it's interesting, the issue of anxiety and how it affects people's decisions goes down to that sort of level. And it's something that people often overlook.
No, absolutely. And as you said, that bit about culture was because what does culture give us? Because we're constantly trying to check out, how do I fit in? How do I belong here?
Yeah.
And culture gives us those kind of guidelines, so to speak. Doesn't matter what you need to do to fit in here and be part of the tribe. So it's really important to us. And again, one of the things I think we underestimate in organisations is that we are deeply, deeply social creatures. And I think we get that in our personal lives. But I think we do somehow expect employees as they walk through the workplace door to switch that off somehow and be more professional, and relationships shouldn't matter in the same way, but they absolutely do. So that whole thing about how do I fit in, how do I belong? And we've all, I guess we all remember back to when we were first day in a new company, and it does make you anxious. How do I fit in here? Am I going to get on with people? Is my manager going to like me? All those kind of things. And they matter hugely to us. And we're quite distracted. Again, our brains are quite distracted until we feel I do belong. So I think there's all the things that are important and anxiety gets in the way of making good decisions.
So in the book, you talk about storytelling. You talk about communication and the role of storytelling. Now, I'm a huge fan of storytelling. And, anything I've done a lot of work on analogy.
Right.
That was one of the spin-outs for my research, was this, understanding affective awareness, but engagement to bring around behavioural change. And then the culture aspects. And then I had this aha moment. I was like, wow, that's why analogies work. That's, and that's why storytelling works. And then I set up the Analogies Project.
Right.
because I had like 4 analogies in my head that I was like, I've been using these for years. And the reason why I'd been using them for years is that actually they worked. People got them.
Yes.
And so, yeah, we created this online open source, and it's been amazing that we've had 160, 170 different sort of analogies from different contexts submitted to us by, people. I think majority of them are from the security profession. Always really appreciate the effort that they put into putting these analogies together and submitting, but also from people outside the security profession. So I really am an absolute believer in storytelling and the analogy. But do you want to give us a bit of a more of a scientific view on this rather than my passion for it?
Yeah, no, and you're absolutely right. And I think what's fascinating about storytelling is it goes right back. We can see it right back in Stone Age times, can't we? With pictures on walls and caves, and and children loving stories, and in fact we choose to read books or go to the cinema and see films. That we just love stories. As human beings, we love stories, and I think and they work for all sorts of reasons, in all sorts of ways, all sorts of positive things. One of the things I think storytelling does, and again, I think why they can be very useful when we're going through change, is I think so often when we are going through change, we kind of feel like we've got to have our deck of slides with our rationale as to why this change is good and why it's going to be beneficial. But what decks of slides tend to do, and words on a slide or on a screen, they activate certain parts of our brain, the parts of our brain that process language and make meaning out of language. But they also activate the analytical part of our brain. So if someone stands over the whole of the slides trying to persuade us about this change program, part of what goes on in our heads is, well, what do I think about that? Do I agree with this person? Do I disagree with it? What do I think about it? But if we tell somebody a story, it's a way of kind of planting an idea in somebody's head in a much less confrontational way, and it activates far more parts of the brain. So if we're perhaps telling a story about children running along, throwing a ball to each other, as we talk about children running along, throwing a ball to each other, that activates the motor cortex in our brains as we hear that story. So this part of our brain enables us to run along and throw a ball.
Yeah.
So storytelling activates far more parts of the brain than words on a slide do. So that's one part of it. We experience far more. Secondly, they found that the brain of the listener and the storyteller begin to synchronize as the story is being told, because I guess the same parts of the brain are being activated at the same time.
Okay.
But what's really interesting about storytelling is a way of dropping an idea into somebody's head in a much less confrontational way, because it doesn't activate the analytical part of the brain the same way. So I kind of hear this story, and in a way what it gives me, again, going back to the point about choice, I've got choice about what do I make of that story? What do I take from that? I can choose how I interpret that story.
Yeah.
As I mentioned earlier, choice is hugely important to the brain. So that's some of the reasons why storytelling works. It's far more involving. It gives me choice. The other important thing I think to say about stories is they tend to have an emotional component to them in a way that words on a slide do not. And emotions are really important for the brain in terms of memory. Our brains tend to say, if this has moved you in some way, this story, be it bad, be it good, remember it. Because somehow, if it's moved you, it might be important for future survival. Yeah, exactly. So the whole emotional part, and again, any learning, stories, emotions are a really important component of that, because emotions are memorable to us.
Yeah, that's really, really well put, and it just makes sense, doesn't it? You can, if you're going in there with slides, the presentation and all that, if the science highlights, it's basically turning on that part of the brain which is the analytical part of it. Yeah, you're more likely to get the confrontation. Whereas storytelling, but then with the storytelling, the important thing is about understanding the audience, how they're going to respond to that story. And this is the thing that, again, this is an awareness thing for me. It's like becoming aware by actually understanding who your target audience are, and then a whole range of things about them, like what are the values? Okay, yes. and embed those values into part of how you design the story, because I think sometimes you have stories which get designed, now somebody comes up with a story, I'll create a story, and they create a story, but they create a story for themselves, not for their audience. And it's, you're not convincing yourself, you're trying to, bring people on that journey. And so that's where you have to understand something about the audience. And if you don't take the time, then you can't design the story which leverages just, these insights into the brain.
Yes, no, absolutely. You've got to understand the audience and what works with them, and yes, and particularly I think it's leaders who understand the audience, who strike it right in terms of the right emotion, the right content of the story, who get that. You need to get that right. It's not just any old story. It's getting that right and getting the tone right. The other thing I need to do really well, I guess, often also what's in stories is a certain amount of disclosure too, that leaders who will share perhaps some of their anxieties or some of their concerns, that kind of say, I'm not perfect either. Yeah. I've had concerns, or what. When leaders do that, I think that can be such a huge relief for the rest of us, because you can kind of go, oh yeah, I've had problems with this too. So I think that's the other nice thing about stories. So you can have that element of personal disclosure of what I've been struggling with, or what I found difficult, or the mistake I made too. And I think that's hugely liberating for everybody else.
I think it ties in with the theme of authenticity. I've been doing some further research around advertising, because in a way, security as a product, at the end of the day, I've got this security product. It's this policy, process, and procedure, and I need to make people aware of it so that they then choose to buy it, and that once they've bought it, they'll buy it again. So I often use this sort of analogy, metaphor. Authenticity is really important. It's really important to storytelling. People can come up with stories, and people do. You create a story around a brand, for example.
No,
but it's not authentic. No. Okay, and it's just the other thing, when people actually stand and go, "I'm not perfect. These are my concerns." About themselves, the anxieties that they have. People just get a sense of this is an authentic person, because we all know there are things about us that we have concern about. There's things that we think, oh, I'm great at this. There are things that we know we're not so great at. And even those people who potentially think they're great at absolutely everything, in a way, not recognizing the fact that everybody has a vulnerability is in itself a vulnerability. Because it's that sense of, I can never do any wrong, which is, it's understanding that. When hackers understand this type of thing, people trying to exploit people to get, process and procedures, this is the stuff they look for, the sense that I can never do any wrong.
Yes.
Okay, it's just like, actually, those people are great targets because they have that over self-confidence, and that becomes exploitable.
Absolutely. I think it's one of the reasons why, in any group, it's so important to have someone perhaps playing devil's advocate, pointing out the holes in our arguments or the weaknesses. I think it's really good to have somebody in the group that does that to us. Yeah. Because as you say, we often can't see the flaws in our own argument or the weakness. So having, I think organisations where people can do that, can challenge, can question, is really important. And in a way, it's interesting. It goes back to the whole world of aviation back in the 1970s. That one of the things that really turned around and improved safety in the world of aviation, as they could see from all the black box recordings, that quite often the first officer could see there was a mistake, the captain was making a mistake, but didn't have the language to challenge the captain. It was a very hierarchical cockpit. Yeah. And they could see the first officer just didn't know how to say, oh, I think you've made a mistake and we're going down. Yeah. So that recognition of changing the dynamics in the cockpit, equipping the first officer to have the language to challenge the captain, is one of the things that's improved safety in the world of aviation. So giving people the language to challenge, is really important. And people being prepared to say, look, we do all make mistakes, but let's talk about them rather than hide them under the carpet and waiting for a disaster to happen.
Yeah, I think it's a really good example. Okay, so on a final note, at the end of every chat that we have with the guests, we ask them, is there one thing right now that's really exciting you most about the environment, the world that you work within?
Well, I guess for me, I think as we said at the beginning, was that the world of neuroscience, bringing neuroscience into the organisation is still pretty new. I think partly what I find at the moment is take it into organisations, and I think neuroscience, the language of neuroscience, the language of science, is reaching leaders in a way that other things don't, because it is the language of science. Yeah. what I find exciting about it, that's a group of technology people I'm working with at the moment in one of the big banks. And I've been talking about neuroscience and leadership and performance and marginal gains, all this kind of stuff. And because I'm going and talking language of science and the brain, they love it. And their boss said they wouldn't normally be interested in this kind of stuff. But because it's being put it into science and what goes in the brain, they're really lapping it up and taking it on board. Yeah. So for me, that's exciting, that bringing science, bringing neuroscience into the workplace and reaching people who perhaps otherwise would not, naturally be, that interested about how do you help people change. So that to me is this whole bit about bringing neuroscience into the organisation is the language of science, bringing that in. And that's what kind of excites me at the moment. And
this is something that I share with you. It's evidence-based.
Yes.
I love this thing about the evidence base. Has been growing over the last, it's been growing slowly over quite some time, but has really ramped up in the last 30, 40 years. And I think suddenly people are able to go, right, that explains this gut instinct now, or it disproves this gut instinct. And it's that science that enables you to have a chat with people who may have been resistant to the ideas around effective change. And suddenly they go, well, here's the data.
Yeah, absolutely. And it takes it away from being, one person's opinion against another person's opinion. And I think the beauty with the neuroscience is you can say, look, we do now, there's a huge amount we don't know, but we are learning more and more about what goes on in the brain, what helps it to perform at its best.
Yeah.
So the way, once we know those things about what helps the brain perform at its best, then dear leaders in organizations, it's good to understand these things, because if you obviously want your people to perform at their best, your teams to perform at their best, you need to understand these things. And it's not my opinion that these things help people perform best. This is what goes on in the brain. This is what helps it focus. This is what helps it concentrate. This is what helps it be more creative. We know some of those things now. So it takes it away from being a matter of opinion, evidence, and you can kind of say to leaders, well, you can ignore this evidence if you want to, but we kind of do know these things now.
Yeah.
And I think it's a responsibility of every leader, every one of us in a way, to understand a bit more about our brains so that we can work with that knowledge and help people perform at their best. But at the same time, when we're concerned about mental well-being, also perhaps remove some of those stresses and things that cause anxiety in the workplace too.
Brilliant. Oh, it's been absolutely fantastic chatting to you, Hilary.
Pleasure.
Well, I know every guest we have on the show, I get super excited at the end of it. And I'm like, I really, really enjoy that. But I do. I really thoroughly enjoy talking to people who are from outside of the security industries and sort of like, listen to them about the challenges around awareness, behavior, and culture. And in this case with Hilary, about the changing those things and organizational change. And sort of like, okay, yeah, there are key lessons that we want to take away from these insights that other people are able to provide. So it was an absolute pleasure to bring her and her insights to you. And I hope that you really got something out of that. Of course, we'll do what we always do, which is make the meeting notes. And in the meeting notes, we'll mention her book in there as well. So you can always go in and pick up a copy. But just to let you know, one of the things that we have been asked to do by a number of listeners, so a number of people that we met at the SANS Institute was, can we create a list of the books that I've read as part of my research? I counted them actually the other week. I clearly had time on my hands. 99 books. I've got to find one more book to read, which is never a difficult thing for me. But 99 books. I'm not going to create a list of 99 books for you. But what I'm going to look to do is probably create a list which you can sign up to get access to the actual list. And that will be like 3 books about awareness, 3 books about behavior, and 3 books about culture, like top 3 recommended books for you to read. So if you're interested in those books, then just keep an eye out. We'll have something up on the marmaladebox.com website, which you'll be able to register for. And we'll also have something in the LinkedIn group. I believe the LinkedIn group is going to have some discussions created around the books that I have used as part of my research. So yeah, you can stay in contact with us either way. So if this is the first time you've listened to the show, well, the first thing is, thank you for joining us. The second thing is just to confirm what the best way to stay in contact with us is going to be. Really simple, 3 main ways. 1, join our Rethinking the Human Factor group on LinkedIn, and we'll be keeping people up to date with a whole range of stuff and work that we're doing around awareness, behavior, and culture. But we'll also be creating a discussion, a community discussion around challenges we face and the lessons that we've been learning. 2, you can go to the marmaladebox.com website and you can register there for updates on pretty much everything that we do. And the third way of staying in contact with the podcast is to add us to your RSS feed. And then that way you'll just receive an update straight away when the latest podcast is published. So what is the next show all about? Well, for those of you that are new to the show, the format that we've always taken is that we invite 3 people from outside the cybersecurity industry to come and have a chat with us about awareness, behavior, and culture. Why do we do that? Quite simply because awareness, behavior, and culture are not unique to cybersecurity. So, there are lots of people out there that have been tackling these very issues that we face within the cybersecurity industry and making a success of doing that. And the whole thing we were trying to do here within the podcast is to bring those people in. But we want our listeners to get involved in the show as well. So for every 3 interviews we do with somebody outside of the security industry, we invite one listener to come on the show and basically share with us the lessons they've learned from the past 3. And the last listener to come on the show was Louise Coburn, who was absolutely fantastic. And I actually got the opportunity to meet Louise at the SANS Institute event in November. So we're going to have a listener come on the show. Now, we don't actually have a listener lined up. I don't think it's going to be a problem. I'm pretty sure that we'll be able to get a listener signed up. If you're a listener, you've got to be either education and awareness, you've got to be a manager, or you've got to be an education awareness consultant, or you're going to be a CISO who is responsible for awareness, behavior, and culture within your organization. If you'd like to come on the show, if you'd like to be considered as a guest to come on the show to talk about what you've learned from the show, but also your broader experience, best way to do that is to get in contact with us at podcast@re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com. Let me repeat that for you. That's podcast@re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com. So just a reminder to anybody that attended the SANS Institute, who bought a book, and who wants access to the 9 videos. So that's 1 video per chapter with a 1-minute summary from myself. If you still want that, we've got to ask you to send in an email to us to confirm that you do want that video. And email address again to do that is going to be at podcast@re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com. Right then. Well, thank you very much for joining us on the show. The next show will be out in January. We're taking a small Christmas break, but we'll be back in January, and we'll be back with one of our listeners, to be confirmed. And then after that show, we'll be having a chat with a lady by the name of Char Sample. And I absolutely promise you that what Char's going to be talking about in relation to culture is something that, based on the conversations I had with people at the SANS Institute, 200 education and awareness professionals, it's something that people just haven't really got their heads around. It's just not even on the radar. So you can't miss that show. And if you don't want to miss it, best way to do that is RSS feed. Join us on the LinkedIn group, the Rethinking the Human Factor LinkedIn group. Or the third way is to register for updates from the marmaladebox.com website. And that way you will never miss a show, and you will not miss the conversation we had with Charles Sample. In the meantime, have an absolutely fantastic Christmas and have a happy new year. And I'm really looking forward to sharing more insights with you in 2019. Thank you very much.